Welcome to Hope for Today, a weekly Bible teaching program that will bring you hope for every day. It is so good to be with you. Thank you for joining us as we study God's Word. The Bible is full of practical truth which we can put into daily practice. It does not matter where you are from. His words will instruct and form all of us, if we allow them to. That is a pretty big if, and we must have hearts that are soft toward Him. Today's lesson, we'll be looking at Jesus' teaching on the Sabbath. We won't finish the whole teaching today, but we'll continue this the next time as well. So, if you can, turn to the end of Mark chapter 2 and follow along as we dig into Jesus' teaching on the Sabbath.
Does God care about animals? In the late 1700s, in the city of London, there were fruit and vegetable peddlers who discovered that their donkeys could carry their loads 50 kilometers every day if they allowed the donkey to rest one day out of 7. However, if those same peddlers worked their donkeys 7 days a week, those same donkeys could only travel 25 kilometers a day. Now, as you suspect, the livelihood of these peddlers depended on their animals, and they discovered that they lost 120 kilometers of travel every week if they worked the donkey every day. And not only that, they ended up with a sick and a shabby-looking donkey. But if they used that donkey only 6 days a week, they gained several thousand kilometers of travel every year, and they had a nice, sleek-looking donkey. So I go back to my opening question. Do animals benefit from the 10 Commandments? Does God care about them? Well, listen to Deuteronomy 5:14. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son, or your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest, as well as you. And he doesn't say it, but the implication is that your ox and your donkey can rest too. God made men and God made donkeys. He knew what was good for them, and he put both of them into the commandments. In our study of Mark's gospel, we've already learned that the ordinary people flocked to hear Jesus teach. Compared to traditional Jewish belief, his teaching was like a new garment that would replace an old one, or like new wine that would burst old wineskins. We talked about the last time. The Pharisees had begun to oppose Jesus openly, and so Jesus confronts them with the statement that he is the one qualified to decide what constitutes keeping the Sabbath, not them. Several words from his statement became the title for today's study, Lord of the Sabbath. I will give this teaching in 2 parts. Today is part 1. Now let us read our text, Mark chapter 2, beginning with verse 23 and reading through chapter 3, verse 6. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? But Jesus said to them, Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and he also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. And he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand. So they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, Step forward. Then he said to them, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they kept silent. And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. In this text, Jesus supports his claim to the lordship of the Sabbath by posing two different arguments. Today we'll look at the first one, his argument from scriptural precedent. The scene that Mark creates for us in our text must have been quite common at that time. And according to Deuteronomy 23:25, if you were walking by a grain field or an olive grove or a vineyard, you could pick and eat what you needed to satisfy your hunger. So picture Jesus and his disciples walking beside a field of grain. And as they're walking, the disciples strip the heads of grain from the stalk. They rub the kernels together in their hands to remove the outer husks. I remember doing that in my childhood. And after you rub the kernels together in your hand to remove the husks, you blow gently and the husks float away, and you have a ready-made snack. Now, it's not very tasty, but it is nutritious. And so the disciples are satisfying their hunger, but the Pharisees immediately accuse them of doing something that was unlawful on the Sabbath day. We might ask, how so? To the Pharisees, there were three simultaneous violations of the law that were occurring. The disciples were reaping, they were threshing, and they were preparing food. Who said that the actions of the disciples violated the law? It was the Pharisees. They saw themselves as the final judges of the law. But Jesus had something to say about that. But before I look at Jesus' response, I want to say a bit about the Pharisees. You know that Jesus was sharply critical of them, but he also realized their sincere attempts to obey the law. If that were not true, then he wouldn't have said something like this. The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do not do after their works, for they say, and do not do. That's Matthew 23:2-3. So Jesus didn't fault them for their study and application of the law. He faulted them for giving their interpretations equal weight with the scriptures. So because Jesus and his disciples didn't keep the law exactly the way the Pharisees thought it should be kept, they were pronounced guilty of breaking it. Jesus responded by appealing to the scriptures. That's why I've called this first point his argument from scriptural precedent. He takes them back to the experience of David in 1 Samuel chapter 21. David was fleeing from Saul, and he came to the town of Nob. This was the location of the tabernacle during the reign of Saul. David was hungry, so he asked Ahimelech the priest for 5 loaves of bread or whatever was available. And Ahimelech told him the only thing he had on hand was showbread, the hallowed bread, the bread of the presence. The bread of the presence was 12 loaves, 1 loaf for each tribe of Israel. And these loaves were not little either. Each one was made from 2/10 of an ephah. That was about 4 liters. And Jewish sources that I read say that each loaf weighed about 5 kilograms. This bread was a symbol of God's desire for fellowship and communion with his people. It was the only bread Ahimelech had on hand. And that hallowed bread was to be eaten by the priests. Jesus said it was for the priests alone. Now, what Jesus' illustration shows us is that human need supersedes the letter of the law. Now, I know someone can take that statement as a license to do whatever they want, but that violates the spirit of Jesus' teaching because the key is not what you want, the key is human need. Today within Christendom, there's a lot of debate about how this principle of 1 day in 7 should be observed. Is it Sabbath? Is it Sunday? Or should we have one special day at all? Those who argue for a Saturday observance point back to Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, the creation account. Those who advocate for a Sunday observance point to the resurrection of Christ and the fact that the early church met for times of worship and fellowship on the first day of the week. You can find that in Acts 20, verse 7, and in 1 Corinthians 16:2. These folks, too, have valid points for their practice. Then there's another group that says we don't have a need for any one day of the week to be set aside as a worship day. They point out that the observance of the Sabbath and the feast days were shadows of the things to come. And so when Jesus died and rose again and ascended to heaven, those shadows and types that were contained in the law were all fulfilled. And so they quote Galatians 4:10 and similar verses. So what do we make of these different ideas and Jesus' teaching? Well, one thing seems clear. Don't reject those who see things differently than you do. At the same time, remember there are biblical commands, like those that are given to us in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23 through 25. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more, as you see the day approaching. I believe that those who argue that no particular day is to be set aside for worship, fellowship, and inspiration have the greatest risk of becoming self-absorbed in their business and their pleasure. There's something valuable about structure and discipline in our lives, yes, even one day a week set aside for rest. But then there's also the danger of becoming what we might call a Sunday Christian. You go to church, you observe the day of rest, but the rest of the week, those who don't know you went to Sunday service could never tell that you were a follower of Christ. So this whole issue becomes really a matter of what is in your heart. I believe that is, at least in part, what Jesus was trying to teach both the disciples and the Pharisees. The Pharisees' rigid enforcement of the rules and regulations turned what should have been a delight. The Sabbath was meant to be a delight, but they had turned it into a drudgery, not only for them, but for those who look to them for spiritual guidance. You know, there are many professing Christians today who see God's commands as wearisome, as a burden. They think God is out to spoil their fun, to make their lives monotonous. And they feel this way because they focus on themselves and what they want and what they enjoy. But Jesus said that joy in life comes from learning to serve others. As God in the flesh, Jesus perfectly understood the needs of his followers, and he still understands your needs and mine today. And so he said to the Pharisees, I'm the master of the Sabbath. I helped write these laws, and I will show you how to interpret them. Here we have the living word appealing to a precedent in the written word to establish his authority to interpret the law.
Thanks, J. Mark, for this teaching on the Sabbath. I don't know how you apply this teaching of the Sabbath where you live, but we know it is important to understand the principle when we study doctrines like this one. J. Mark mentioned the verses in Genesis and shared some ways others apply this teaching. As usual, there are many different perspectives on this. So I encourage you, dig into God's Word and then apply His teaching to your life. Don't view this as drudgery. This is for our own good. God knows us, and the things He tells us to do are a benefit to us. If you have any questions about today's lesson, or if you'd like to contact us for any reason, you can reach us by email or internet. Our email is hope@heraldsofhope.org, and our website is heraldsofhope.org. There, click on the Contact Us, which is on the top right, and you can message us directly from there. We'd love to hear from you, so please contact us however it works best for you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Lord willing, you can join us next time as we finish this teaching on the Sabbath. To close, I will read the verse in Genesis 2, which J. Mark referred to earlier. This is foundational, and it's a good thing to think about as you go. On the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made.